call on some of the people who have asked the question to maybe clarify a little bit more. So I'm not really clear. Ankan has asked a question about SEPT and GPCRs. About SRP and GPCRs, is that what you're saying? I'm not entirely sure I understand this question. So Ankan, if you're here, would you like to ask your question again and maybe clarify a little bit? In the meantime, I guess we'll move on to the next question. So Mavileti Sai Kiran has asked, was the assay done with both PNA1 and PNA22 species where applicable to see any complementary effect? I think the question is about the bacterial growth assay. Is that right? And I think someone else has a similar question. So was this specific to bacterial strains or is it working with most pathogenic strains? So I'll basically answer this. So we've done this with various different bacterial strains. So the assay that I showed was with a strain called AS19. And this is a strain that is what people typically use in these kinds of studies where they use peptide nucleic acids and such. And this is because this strain has a mutation in the lipopolysaccharide layer that allows for easy entry of these agents into the bacterial cell. However, if you don't use AS19, we've also done it with other normal bacterial strains like BL21 and DH5 alpha and so forth, and we see the same effects. So basically, the extent of the inhibition might be slightly different depending on the bacterial strain you're using, but qualitatively the answer remains the same. So, okay, then I'll move on to the next question, which is asked by M. Jayaprakash, which is, does M1 binding to insulin affect the role on the function of insulin? So yes, I've shown assays where I've shown that indeed the function of insulin is maintained even after treatment with M1. So hope that answers your question. Okay, so there is another question by Akankshika Paridha, who's asking whether upon binding of M1 to insulin, does it affect the primary structure? And given that the structure has changed to beta sheet. Yeah, so basically what we see is that after treatment with M1, there is, depending on the concentration, of course, we have some beta sheet because M1 is not able to completely shut down inhibition, but a significant fraction of the protein is still in a functionally competent form, and that we have shown using the assay, the assay in Drosophila. So the protein is still functional. And I guess just to complement that answer, if we don't do that and we let the insulin aggregate, then we don't see that function. So yes, the beta sheet form of insulin is not functional. I hope that answers your question. So another question is, is M1 toxic to cells in insulin work? And the answer is no. And I've shown in, let me just try to go back to the slides over here. Okay, so I don't have the data for M1, unfortunately, but I do have it for some of the other molecules. And you can see that the molecules themselves are not toxic. Okay, and we find the same result for M1. Unfortunately, I don't have it on my slide over here today. Okay, so there's another question by Indranil Bhattacharya, who's asking that in the case of the SRP system, which was the first part of the talk, can we use the protein and not the RNA so that more selectivity can be achieved? And I think it's a valid question. So basically the question is, can we direct the inhibitor against the protein rather than the RNA? And in principle, it is fine. It should make no difference. But we decided to go with the RNA first because we knew how to make sequence-specific molecules that could bind RNA. In the case of protein, the diversity is more. We have 20 amino acids as opposed to the 4 RNA DNA bases. So the complexity is less. But in principle, it is possible. And there are lots of people who are working on making inhibitors of proteins. And so it can certainly be done. But it's a slightly harder problem, and I think that is something that we want to address in the second step. So first, we just wanted to show proof of principle, whether the idea actually works. And now that we know that the idea works, we would like to take this further. So another question is insulin aggregation a temporary or permanent phenomena? It is a permanent phenomena. Once the insulin is aggregated, or actually protein aggregation is a permanent phenomena. Once a protein is aggregated, it's very, very hard, if not impossible, to bring it back. So, so once it is aggregated, it's not functional, it's wasted. So another question is from Navendu Pathak, who's asking, why M1 shows more activity towards insulin? Is there any structural combination or something else? So what we suspect is that, yes, there is a specific interaction between M1 and insulin, and this is the result of that. And we're still kind of trying to understand the details. And yeah, we don't know for sure yet, but hopefully, you know, we can have more molecular information. And like I mentioned, we are trying to do 2D NMR studies as well to find out what actually is the molecular nature of these interactions. But I don't have the answer to that right now. So, okay, another question is from Dr. Srinivas, who's asking at what pH were the studies with PAT1 carried out? So usually so for the thioflavin T assay, which is this assay over here, typically it is carried out at pH 1.6. And that's because basically that is just kind of more like a practical solution. So insulin aggregation is faster at acidic pH. And you can see the time scale is somewhere about 12 to 15 hours. However, we can do the same thing at a higher pH, and the result qualitatively remains the same. So at pH 7 or 7.4, which is the physiological pH, we see similar effects. But so in these assays were done with pH 1.6, and pretty much every other assay, the cell viability assay and others were done at pH 7. So Srinivas, does that answer your question? Would you like more clarification? Okay, I guess we'll move on. Yeah, I think, okay, so I'll just take up the follow-up of this, which is, will PAT1 be in zwitterionic form? So yes, it will be in the ionized form, and that is correct. So, okay, let me just go back to this. So when we do the assay at pH 1.6, basically we expect that, I mean, this will be in the acid form, and the NH2 will also be protonated. Okay, and at physiological pH, it is likely to be in the zwitterionic form. But we have conducted assays at various pHs, and in fact, for M1, we've done different pHs, and we see that the result remains the same. In fact, at pH 7.4, the molecule is more active. So yes, yes, the state of the molecule is indeed changing depending on the pH, but it is still able to do whatever it is doing. And that may not be a surprise because these interactions, we expect them to be predominantly hydrophobic, not exclusively, but predominantly hydrophobic. And since we are not changing much about the hydrophobic behavior of the molecules, perhaps that's why we are not seeing a huge difference because of pH. Okay, so okay, so another question which is really interesting is that for the insulin work, what was the thought behind using the molecule S1? Any hints from insulin structure? And that's actually a very nice question. And I did not really address it very much, but so here, this is the insulin sequence. And I had pointed out this region of insulin, which is actually a part of the helix that is shown over here. And we selected these molecules of this family and PAT1 and so forth because these molecules are actually has been shown in the past to be molecules that can bind, so they can sort of present functionality in a manner that can bind helices. And this is something that has been shown in the literature earlier. So that's basically was our initial thought. And then we kind of tried various molecules. And in spite of the fact that all of these molecules belong to the same family, not all of them work. So there's more behind this inhibition and the specificity that we don't quite understand yet. But basically that was the thought with which we started. So another question is that in the cell proliferation assay, why no cells were seen in the presence of insulin aggregate? Even if insulin aggregates, there are other growth factors which can help in proliferation. And that's absolutely correct. And in fact, that is probably just because of the way the screen was, or how the contrast showed up in the screen. So in fact, in the presence of insulin aggregates, also the cells are there, they are dividing, and maybe it will become clear if I show you the quantification of that data. So here, so cells are there even in the presence of insulin aggregates. It's not that they are not there, but it was just probably because of the contrast that you were not able to see it. So we have quantified all of this, and these results are here. So I hope that answers your question. Then there's a question by Rabindra Behera who says that, do you see initial increase in fluorescence intensity upon M1 binding as observed in CD? Okay. I'm not sure I understand that question. Do you see initial increase in fluorescence intensity upon M1 binding as observed in CD? Rabindra, if you're around, can you please explain, because I'm not quite able to understand your question. Is it the fluorescence intensity in the THT assay? Okay, while we are waiting for Rabindra, maybe I'll move on to the next one. So anonymous attendee has asked the question, can you explain the use of vehicle other than control? So yeah, so vehicle was just where we added, so basically what happens is untreated was just the cells by themselves. The vehicle control is what we call when we add an equivalent amount of DMSO. So the molecules, small molecules typically not soluble in aqueous buffers. So what we do is the solution, we make a DMSO stock, and then we dilute it with the buffer, and then we add it to the system. So just to control for that, an equivalent amount of DMSO has been added in the vehicle part, just to make sure that any effects we see are not because of artifacts from DMSO. So I hope that explains your question, or that answers your question. Okay, so there's another question by Sri Devi who's asking that in the first part of the talk, do you think PNA strategy would help in curbing mycobacterium? And it's actually a fantastic question. And we are thinking on the same lines. And let me see if I have the mycobacterium sequence over here. Yeah, so you can see that we've put the mycobacterium sequence over here. And in general, this strategy will be applicable to basically any bacteria. Which has a functional SRP, or where the SRP function is important. However, in the case of mycobacterium, something like PNA1 will not be applicable because we don't have the complementary sequence here. But then the prospect remains that if we want to make specific inhibitors for mycobacterium, then we can go for the specific mycobacterium RNA sequence. So that should still work. So Ankan Nath has asked, can you please elaborate on the NMR techniques used and the specific properties that are being probed? Okay, so here we are not really used any particular NMR technique. This is simply just a 1D proton NMR of the protein by itself and then the protein molecule complex. And essentially we are looking for, peaks or in this case, we are really just comparing insulin and the insulin with molecule, and we see that the profiles, so this is the protein profile, and it remains pretty much the same, which means that the protein has denatured, hasn't denatured or something. And currently we are working on 2D NMR techniques where we are looking for specific interactions. We have to first basically assign the 2D NMR spectrum of insulin, which has actually already been done by other people. So we're going to take that result, and then we're going to see when we apply the molecule, which of those peaks change, because then that will tell us that those are the specific residues of insulin that are being affected by the protein, by the molecule. And so that will give us some idea about the binding site of the molecule on the protein. So basically those are the things that we're working on. So there's another question by Sabyasachi Mandal, which is in the SRP, where DNA bases, anchored bases are attached. Are they not dissociation by enzymes in the body? Not really sure I understand the question. Maybe you can try to clarify the question a little bit and then I can address it. Okay, so there is another question by Rabindra Behera, which is what is the effect of PNA2? You discussed only about PNA1. However, both PNA1 and PNA2 are possibly forming the complex. That is correct. So, so basically the thing is that, I mean, this is more of a sort of a practical limitation for us. We did not do the assay with PNA2, the bacterial growth assay with PNA2, because, so like I mentioned earlier, we are buying the conjugates from a company and these are very, very expensive. So between PNA2 and PNA1, since PNA1 was the better one, we decided to go for the CPP conjugate or the cell penetrating peptide conjugate of PNA1 because without it, they don't enter the cells and we don't get the result. So it's just more like a practical limitation and, you know, it's, yeah, I mean, we should you know, try with PNA2 as well and see. And I'm expecting that the same kind of result will be there, although the effectivity or the efficacy of PNA2 might be less. That would be my guess. But we have not actually performed the assay with PNA2 because of the practical limitation of cost. So yeah, what percentage of people are really affected by insulin aggregation and what are the side effects of this aggregation? So yes, aggregation is a problem. And so I guess one thing that I want to say here is that in the body, at least under normal physiological conditions, insulin is not known to aggregate. Okay, so this only happens in conditions where, for example, you have industrial production of insulin, where they are making insulin and then you know, packaging it in vials and whatever for people to take it. So that's where the aggregation happens. And so basically, what happens then is that usually you have to store the insulin in the fridge, and you are supposed to discard it after about 28 days or so. So basically, this compromises the lifetime of the insulin. And what may also happen is that the dose of insulin that is delivered to the patient, that dose is variable. Okay, as a result, you know, the glucose metabolism, you know, that the patient will experience variable results. Okay, and yeah, so again, one of the main side effects of aggregation that that is concerning is that as people who use, for example, people use insulin pumps where basically the insulin is injected to their body at specific times at the same site. So over time, the insulin, because of the high local concentration, it aggregates. And then what happens is that this prevents, so now when the next dose is administered to the patient, basically the patient gets even less of insulin. Okay, so essentially what happens is that the bioavailability of insulin is reduced. So the patient gets less and less dose of the aggregation. And so the glucose metabolism will not be as well, basically. So that is the main side effect. There are other side effects of aggregation of insulin that are known, but they are relatively mild. And typically what is done is that the insulin aggregates are surgically removed if the problem becomes serious. So basically that's what it is. But essentially what happens is over time, the dosage of active insulin that is delivered to the patient becomes variable, actually reduces. So that's the problem. So there's another question by Shubhan, which says, what is the model for studying insulin fibrillation? I'm not sure I understand the question. So our initial experiments were done in vitro. And then the later experiment where we were showing insulin functionality was done in Drosophila wing disc culture. Okay, so that's basically what we're using. So there's another question by Hariharan Murthy, which is what factors affect insulin aggregation? So typically it's acidic pH, high temperature, agitation. So these are the things that affect insulin aggregation, and usually it happens more outside than in the physiological condition. And like I said, under normal physiological conditions in the body, I don't think there are any reports that normally insulin aggregates. It's only under you know, conditions of diabetes where people are taking insulin, external insulin injections. That's where insulin aggregation is seen. So it usually happens outside more commonly. So there's another question by Jivaji, which is asking, considering the SRP inhibitor, can an assay be thought of to probe which pathway is opted by a particular signal peptide? Can an assay be thought of? Can an assay be thought of to probe which pathway is opted by a particular signal peptide? I think this question may be in the context of protein transport, and in the bacteria, for instance, there are various transport pathways are available. And if you want to know whether some substrate is going through the SRP pathway or not, you can apply the inhibitor and see whether you see downstream transport or not. So perhaps it can be used to study that. And in fact, in our experiments, we are trying to show that we're going to take specific substrate of SRP and show that if we use the inhibitor, then the transport of those substrates will be compromised. So those assays are currently in development. And hopefully, I mean, unfortunately, because of the COVID lockdown, the labs are locked, but hopefully we'll have results on that soon. So there was a question about comparison between SRP and GPCRs. So what was the question again? I'm not really sure, but SRPs are, SRP is at the ER membrane. The GPCRs are usually on the plasma membrane. So yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know in what respect you would want to compare the two. If you would like to clarify your question further, I can answer it. So another question is PNA RNA conjugate effective against both gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria? So we think it should be. So far, we've not done the assays, so we are planning to do these in gram-positive bacteria as well. Our results are in gram-negative bacteria so far, but that is something that we have planned, particularly in Staph aureus and others. So we are working on that. So Ajay, please let me know how long you would like me to continue, and I'm happy to continue actually.
Professor Sarogi, you can take 10 more minutes to answer these questions. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. So, so another question is, how will this help in antibiotic resistance? And it's a good question. So we are not really directly addressing the question of overcoming resistance, but basically what we are trying to suggest here is that we need to have alternative targets that basically are not subject to resistance yet, and so that we can overcome the resistance. So basically by targeting other pathways that are not subject to resistance. And I guess one can argue that, you know, like I mentioned earlier, it's kind of an evolutionary arms race. So once you apply an inhibitor to something else, perhaps it's only a matter of time before bacteria will develop resistance against those as well. But I guess that's what it is really, and we really have to, you know, sort of keep fighting this war with bacteria. There is another question by Ravi Kumar Govindan, which says that which one do you think better is PNA1 CPP or small molecule? Yeah, so that's again a very good question. So as you know, PNA is not readily cell permeable, and it has you know, other problems. So PNA, in my opinion, PNA might not be the ideal inhibitor, and that's why I kind of alluded to at the conclusion of that part of the talk. I alluded to various small molecules that can be used, and my opinion is that the small molecule pathway or the small molecule inhibitors would be better. And I guess that's what we're working on at the moment, because they can be more specific. Yeah, and then these other issues that PNA1 has, for example, you know, penetration, etc., they can be addressed better in the small molecule. So again, another question by Indranil Bhattacharya: how can we actually administer or introduce the SRP inhibitor to a human body? So okay, here what I would like to say is that our work here is just proof of principle, and a lot of work actually goes into making, you know, a molecule into a drug. So there are those various factors that are there, lots of, you know, various clinical trials, lots of things have to be done before you can actually think about introducing, you know, something into an human body. So it will have to go through the whole process. So I don't know if that answers your question. Okay. So another question is why bacterial strain develop resistance with exposure to strain to environment? Why with exposure to antibiotics? I guess basically that's the question. So basically what happens is that this is just how evolution works. So bacteria grow very fast. Bacteria grow and reproduce very fast. So every time, and the doubling time is about 20 minutes. So every time they they double or they reproduce. So there is the option that some mutations might happen, and some of these mutations might give it an evolutionary advantage. For example, in the case of antibiotics, for instance, you know, if they're exposed to antibiotics a lot, then what will happen is, you know, every so often there'll be some mutation that will give evolutionary advantage to that strain. And what will happen is, over time, because the doubling time is very quickly, those are the ones with the mutations are the one that will be able to survive, and very soon they will dominate the population. So essentially, that's basically how resistance happens. And again, this is just a natural evolutionary process, and we can't really do much to stop the process. So we just have to fight it. So again, another question from Srinivas: have you thought of replacing NH2 with OH or SH in PAT1? So no, the answer is so far we've not done yet, but yeah, those are good ideas, and we should try to do those and see what happens. And yeah, actually, I think this relates to your earlier question about pH. So yeah, as the pKa of these groups change, we can check and see if these will change the inhibitory effect. Yeah, that's a good point. We have not done that yet. So, okay, another question from Jay Prakash is that, does PNA1 binding assay to RNA show specificity with sequence? Yes. So we have performed these RNA mutational studies, and we have done, we have made RNAs with single and double mutants and subjected them to the same gel shift assay that I showed you. And in fact, the binding does change. So, so when we have RNA with one mutation, with one mismatch with PNA1, then the binding is weaker. And then when we have RNA with two mismatches, the binding is almost non-existent. And these results are available in the supplementary information for the paper that I mentioned. So if you're interested, please go ahead and take a look. So another question is, does these molecules inhibit A-beta aggregation inside the cells, inside brain cells? So, well, we've not probed A-beta aggregation, and this is certainly something that we want to do. So I don't have the answer to that question yet. We've not done that. My guess would be that this specific molecule, for example, M1, might not inhibit A-beta. I mean, because some of the assays we've done with alpha-synuclein suggest that M1 does not inhibit alpha-synuclein. So maybe there is some specificity for insulin, but really the only way to answer it is to do the experiments and find out. And we've not done that yet, but we would certainly like to do that. So what type of cells were used for the insulin study? I think it was HEK cells over here. Ma'am, you've used compounds like M1 in insulin fibrillation. Can you explain what type of chemical transformation happens in the molecular level? So again, like I said, the best answer we have is the docking study, which kind of suggests that the key residues that are involved in the interaction are some of these that are labeled over here, and the FFY motif that I had shown you is over here. So that's over here, which was the hydrophobic part. That's also actually the receptor binding site. So that's here. And some of the residues that I had shown in the black oval that falls on the helix, so leucine 11, tyrosine 19, some of these are here. So perhaps the main residues that are involved in binding are some of these residues. But again, this is just a molecular docking study, and we would have to do a much more detailed molecular analysis to kind of explain where the molecules are binding. So we don't have that information yet. So again, another question from Ravindra Behra is that M1 binding changes the alpha helical structure to beta sheet and then CD decreases, whether you see similar changes in the THT assay. So I would like to interpret the results slightly differently. So M1 binding doesn't really change the alpha helical structure to beta sheet. That is something that normally happens in insulin. And what we are doing by application of M1, we are trying to stop that process, or at least reduce that process to a significant extent. And so the reduction in CD that we see is what we think is because the amount of beta sheet has reduced. Okay, and that's why we see the reduction in CD. But we do not see any increase in the helical structure, and likely that is because maybe we are arresting some of these partially folded intermediates with the molecule. Maybe that's why we are not seeing the increase in this CD signature over here. And the results are generally consistent with the THT assay, where here we are seeing reduction in beta sheet, and the same thing we are seeing in the CD as well. So reduction in the beta sheet is seen. So the results of the CD and the THT assay are consistent. Oh, I'm sorry. So can the SRP pathway be applied to inhibit viral proteins? So I don't think, actually, I don't know. That's an interesting question. Actually, I don't know if any of the viral proteins are transported by the SRP pathway. That would be something that would be worth looking at. Presumably, what happens is that actually I am not very familiar with you know, the viral systems, but I don't think they use the SRP pathway. If they do, then it will be possible, but I will have to check that. So PNS CPP kills tenfold killing of bacteria. Is this conjugate harmful to the host cells? So I guess the way to answer the question would be what we are. I think your question is about the eukaryotic cells. And we do not have a clear answer to that yet. And I briefly mentioned that we are doing this work in collaboration with one of my colleagues in biology, where we are trying to see, Dr. Himanshu Kumar, where we are trying to see that whether the PNA conjugates are killing the eukaryotic cells or not. And our very preliminary indication is that they are not. And that would also be consistent with the design aspect that I showed you in the beginning. But we still have to await the final experimental result to conclude that for sure. So again, there is a question by Akanshika which says, do you think the insulin M1 complex will behave similarly as that of insulin in humans? So the insulin that we are using is indeed recombinant human insulin. So it should work the same way, but the incorporation of M1 will significantly affect the mechanism. Have you planned any in vivo experiments? So as of now, we don't have any in vivo experiments, but we would certainly like to take it to mouse models and then see how M1 insulin complex behaves in mouse models. And that will give us perhaps some idea about what it might do in humans. But that those experiments are still planned and we don't really have the result yet. So another question is by Shubhan, who's asking, what is the mechanism of bacterial killing? So like I said, I think this is about the SRP work. And what we think is that the bacteria are dying because they don't have a functional SRP cycle. And because of that, the proteins are not being transported to the locations that they should be. And because of that, the bacteria are dying. So that's basically the hypothesis we have as of now. What type of RNA are you using? Is it related to RNAi? Not really. It's not RNAi, but it is the same kind of philosophy. It's antisense RNA that we are using. It's an antisense mechanism that we are using. So these peptide nucleic acids, PNA, bind to RNA in an antisense manner. So it is like RNAi, but it's not really RNAi. Okay, so I think that's all the questions. Okay, there's one more. Do you think breaking up disulfide bonds would restrict the aggregate formation? I'm not entirely sure, but then if you break the disulfide bonds, then if the protein is not functional, then that would not be very helpful. So, so that may not be a very viable strategy, in my opinion.